Welcome back to Media7. Amid the clamour of the news of the day, the anniversary of an event that changed the country has rather gone missing. That event is the 1984 snap election, 25 years ago. Sarah Daniels' Take Two takes us back.
June 14, 1984. Prime Minister Robert Muldoon calls a snap election.
The New Zealand people, if they want me to lead a government, they'll vote accordingly. If they want that other bloke to lead a government, they'll vote for him.
Close to midnight and in high spirits, the Prime Minister with the announcement that shocks the nation.
By high spirits, he really means pickled.
If you don't want it that way, go the other way.
Not at the meeting with Sir Robert was Deputy Leader of the party, Mr Macleay.
My impression was that an early election was the farthest thing from his mind.
And Muldoon had a little surprise for Lady Muldoon too.
Going to Auckland, I'm going to top off a hotel. What do you think about that?
The snap election shocker would herald the dawn of a new era.
Despite last night's surprise announcement, they're all geared up and ready to go.
There was a sense of urgency.
All those, would you? Well, no, 6 and bring them in fast.
Down at National's headquarters, they're tapping into the party's computer, which holds the key data they need to fight this election.
Yes, there was a computer, just the one. Even Sir Bob Jones had his oar in.
Labour, I believe, will win very comfortably. I think that what the early election will do will save the National Party. It certainly won't save the National Government.
The last time a snap election was called was during the waterfront dispute 33 years earlier. This time, the outcome would be very different for National.
What we regard as a good working majority is 15. What we regard as an acceptable majority is 1. And I'll take anything in between.
Labour was poised for victory.
We start tomorrow.
That's right.
Muldoon had held power since 1975, but it would all be over when voters turned out in record numbers to vote him off the island.
That's it.
That's it.
Sarah Daniel there. With me now are 3 people who were there then. Former National MP Marilyn Waring, whose decision to cross the House on nuclear-free legislation set it all in motion. Long-time journalist and TV producer Richard Harman, who was in the press gallery at the time, and his then gallery colleague and future Dominion Post editor Richard Long. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Marilyn, now I suppose depending on political viewpoint, either you sparked the change that New Zealand so desperately needed, or it's all your fault. Did you have any inkling at the time of the changes that you were setting in motion?
Well, the changes that I was setting in motion, as opposed to the ones you might be thinking about, were first of all to put an end to a government that was bankrupt in terms of policy and did not know how to write a budget. Secondly, to give effect to the overwhelming majority of the New Zealand public who wanted a nuclear-free New Zealand. And thirdly, to bring an end to a government which, in the 48 hours before that, had threatened me in a constitutional manner, which meant that democracy was a joke. So that's what I was doing. I'm not responsible for anything else that happened.
Yes. Well, what did you say to the press afterwards? Did you have much to say? Because as I recall at the time, you did keep it very much to the issue being that legislation. What did you have to say afterwards?
I had a press statement that was available, but I disappeared. In the confrontation in the Whip's office, Muldoon had drunkenly accused me of just wanting your name all over the front pages of the papers, you know. I said to him at the time, "You're making a grave mistake. Prime Minister, I'm not the issue. And I'm going to make sure I'm not the issue." I was hidden for 6 days. Television crews camped outside my home in Cambridge. Neighbours reported everything. And I was hidden right up into the moment that I stepped on an Air New Zealand plane bound for Sydney Air New Zealand quietly got me onto that plane, and when I walked onto it and people saw it was me, they stood up and gave me a standing ovation.
That's a marvellous story. Richard Harmon, did you know where Marilyn had gone? Were you among the pack looking for her?
Absolutely, among the pack looking for her. I was frustrated as hell. We couldn't find her anywhere. I knew some of her friends, and I tried every lever I could think of to try and prise that information out of them, but we couldn't find them.
Now, there were many things changed then, including, I suspect, the culture and character of parliamentary reporting. Was that your experience? You were there both before and after?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the 1984 election was the beginning of a new style of parliamentary reporting. It was the beginning of the dominance of television in terms of political journalism. And it was the first election that was made for television. At least the Labour Party part of it was. Muldoon still thought it was a print election, and he went around the country holding press conferences and delivering speeches. But David Lange did things like take rides in jet boats or choose locations to make statements. And at the same time, a more adventurous style of television journalism was going much further than the old journalism of record. And this was the beginning of a huge watershed in the press gallery. The cosy print club that had dominated it up till then was the beginning of the end for them.
What do you make of that phrase, the cosy print club? Was that fair?
Well, I wouldn't go quite that far. But to go back, though, to the calling of the snap election, which is a huge gamble, you get about 3 theories on this, and one is the drinking. Well, certainly there was a drinking culture at the time, and you remember one famous occasion, Don McKinnon had to rush down to the Beehive basement and let the tyres down on Muldoon's car so he couldn't drive home. And he certainly had been drinking that night, as you saw in the clips, lots of slurring. And there was the Tom Scott cartoon, woke up, he shot up in bed the next morning and said to Thea, did I mention anything about a snap election last night? But, it wasn't that, it was calculated. Now, the theory Muldoon gave was that it was all because of Marilyn and Mike Minogue. But I think Lange actually put his finger on it. He said that he couldn't draw a budget. And when you think about it, after all those years of regulation, the cupboard was bare, there was nowhere else to go. He couldn't run the whole year without drawing a budget. There was nothing there. So he had to go, really.
Yeah, but some of us who knew that were able to lead the horse to water and make him drink.
Yeah.
There would not have been a snap election.
Must have been difficult.
No, it wasn't difficult at all.
No, I've been making him drink.
Somebody like George Gear was always really disappointed in me. He said, why didn't you come and talk to me? I said, I got to the stage I didn't trust any of you. You would have tried to talk me out of it. I knew this man so well by now, I knew exactly what to do. I spent all one night mind mapping it. I knew exactly what I had to do to cause the general election and for it to appear that I was being the scapegoat. I did it all, and I'll write about that one day.
The other thing, though, was that, and Richard was there too, looking at Lange by the day, and he was just leaping ahead. And Muldoon could see that. I mean, he was closer to him in the house than we were in the gallery, and he could just see Lange improving by the day, and he knew he had to chop.
Was it being reported as such? But because the received wisdom now is that Lange was thrashing Muldoon in the house every time they were both there.
Remember, he came into the house as someone described him as a jug-eared oaf. Well, he was transforming into a statesman by the day. And, I mean, Muldoon could see that, and he knew he had to chop him off before he got much further. And he had a leaked Labour Party paper which said they'd have to devalue, so he thought that would make a huge impact. So he went early. And as part of the drinking, that was all planned.
Well, was the drinking reported back in the day? I mean, there was that reference to high spirits in the report we saw, the Tom Scott cartoon. And a couple of years earlier, you'd had Keith Allen on his...
The Minister of Silly Walks.
His stumble home, the Minister of Silly Walks. I'm guessing that kind of thing for a very long time was not reported.
Oh, no.
Was that changing?
No.
The Keith Allen thing became public because he complained to the police that he'd been assaulted, whereas clearly he'd just fallen over and cut himself. And consequently, and Muldoon defended him enormously, but he got dubbed in the gallery the Minister of Silly Walks. And it turned out later that he had hypoglycemia. And then again, to quote Tom Scott, hypoglycemic as a newt, basically.
But to get back to the atmosphere at the time, I don't altogether agree. I mean, I personally thought on the Friday that Muldoon would probably win the election. And then, unfortunately, he topped off the hotel and himself in the process and came up to the old TVNZ studios in Shortland Street and could barely string two words together. And this continued all through the weekend. And we saw him on the Saturday night in Whangarei, where he went to an absurd function, the John Banks debutante ball. And he instead, and a lot of journalists were there, and instead of making a speech, he got up and reminisced about Christmas holidays when he was a kid in the north. But the point I want to come back to is that Bruce Jesson's book Fragments of Labour is really good on this, that the run on the dollar started when Muldoon called the election and continued and intensified as we moved up to election day. Not one of us reported that. Not one of us knew it was going on, maybe because we didn't ask the questions. But there were two elections that took place. There was the election about Muldoon, which is what Longy was happy to campaign on. At the same time, Labour, behind the scenes, were getting ready to deal with the run on the dollar, and that's what we didn't know about. So it was a much more complex campaign, I think, than simply to say it was about the fact that Muldoon had had his time.
This is an interesting one because I've heard this before. There was an economic story that it was maybe considered irresponsible to report. I mean, were you in that position as well, Richard Long?
Well, I didn't know it. Like Richard, I didn't know it, but I mean, it would have been really. I mean, it would have I think, so much worse.
Did you know this, Marilyn?
Yeah. Well, there was a cross section of people in caucus who definitely had it worked out, also on that though was very interesting tensions between the party, so Barry Lay, Sue Wood, who were saying our kitte's not full enough, our membership's not up, we're not in condition to run, people like Hugh Templeton are going to lose. That was one of the things they were saying to me too. At the same time, caucus felt like the tide was going out so fast they could not have an election faster. So Paul East was sent to go and poll caucus, and overwhelmingly it came back saying, yeah, go now, while the party was trying to say, we can't do this.
Getting back to that point about running those stories, because this is something that's quite interesting. The Herald did run the story, and they ran it in their business section on the morning of the election. It was lost to all intents and purposes. Ewart Barnsley at TVNZ got the story, cut the story. Bruce Crossan, we assume acting under orders from Ian Cross, refused to allow it to go to air on the Friday night before the election.
Was that known at the time,
yes,
that the story had been pulled?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, it was the night before the election.
And Richard Long, also you would have been aware that there was this other message that the incoming Labour government was giving to the business sector, saying there are going to be major reforms. Was that well known amongst the political journalists, and was there a degree of excitement about it?
No, well, I think you knew to some extent, but you're too busy following the daily political stuff to deal with that in any detail. And of course, people couldn't talk on it. It would be irresponsible to talk to too great an extent on it anyway. But doesn't it just show the way we've changed? Here we are now, the politicians in Parliament are saying, what can we do to whack the banks? Well, about interest rates, how do we bring them down? Well, Muldoon had the answer, the great regulator, he regulated them. Basically, the lending rates will be so-and-so. And actually, as I was told not so long ago, one of the frightening things he was thinking about doing as well, before he was deposed, was regulating deposit rates as well. Well, can you just imagine that step on top of what we already had, the most regulated economy outside the Eastern Bloc?
It would have been extraordinary. The one thing we haven't talked about, actually, Marilyn, is that Maori were on the brink in 1984 as well. The Waitangi Day that year there was a sense that something was about to go. Were you aware of that as well?
But that had been building for a very long time.
But it seemed like it had reached a...
Well, I don't know, only if you were looking for the sensational, once a year. Early 70s, Ngā Tamatoa. Muldoon had major engagement with gangs, mostly around PEP schemes and that kind of thing. Of course, he thought he had Fina alongside, and he tried to walk tight ropes in between all of that. But when it came to something like the treaty legislation, he was nowhere to be found. So, he wasn't kind of in tune around that either. But that sort of fomentation that movement was after Motunui. It was substantial. It wasn't just a one-day wonder, once a year.
We are out of time now. I'm going to conclude with a question. I want a one-word answer from all of you. Is New Zealand a better place than it was before that 1984 snap election?
Yes.
Richard Harman?
Yep,
absolutely.
And I thought you might say that. Well, that is our show for this week. Thanks to our panel, Marilyn Waring, Richard Harman and Richard Long, and to our super panellists, Simon Wilson, Chris Trotter, Hamish Keith and Rod Oram. And thanks to you for watching. We'll be back with Media7 at the same time next week. Until then, goodbye.